Thank you very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. I'm really looking forward to a riveting discussion with two of the most interesting business minds in the world that will help us understand the ingredients of a successful crisis management in organizations and governments. One of the world's leading experts on Israeli economy in general and the tech sector in particular is Dan Senor. Dan is an executive at Elliott Management and co-author of the bestseller book Startup Nation: The Story of Israel's Economic Miracle. Mr. Senor was a senior advisor to Paul Ryan's 2012 vice presidential campaign and a foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. A former Defense Department official, Senor has been based in Baghdad and the U.S. Central Command in Qatar. He was a U.S. Senate aide in the 1990s. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Washington Post. You can listen to his thoughtful interviews on a post-corona world in his new podcast, Post-Corona. Dan will be joining us from New York today. With me in the studio is Michael Eisenberg, an equal partner at Aleph, an early-stage venture capital fund which serves Israeli entrepreneurs who want to build a high-growth, scalable global businesses. Michael is considered among the most successful venture capitalists in the world and was one of the initial investors in companies such as Wix and Lemonade. Aleph celebrated its first IPO last year when Lemonade went public with an incredibly successful debut. Prior to Aleph, Michael was a general partner at Benchmark Capital and continues as a partner responsible for Benchmark's Israeli portfolio. He has invested in, sat, and sits on the boards of Israel's leading companies and startups. Michael has authored several books, including The Tree to Life and Prosperity, and his latest release, a commentary on the book of Vayikra. He remains very involved in Jewish and Israeli causes, sitting on the board of a Shomer Chadash in Yeshivat Har Etzion, and lectures frequently on the topics of venture capital, Israel, and entrepreneurship. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 8 kids. So let's start with an opening question. The world has gone through a period of great crises and great change. What are the most consequential changes, social, cultural, and economic, caused by COVID crisis that you think will endure in a more lasting way? So, Michael.
Boy, only fools prophesy the future. The Talmud is famous for saying that after the destruction of the Second Temple, prophecy was given to fools. So I'm not going to make any predictions. I think we can note a couple of clear trends. One is the acceleration of digitization. We've had a 10-year acceleration in 1 year. I'm fond of saying that people who never used Venmo or an Israel Bit, 85-year-old people don't go to bank branches anymore, take out cash. They just send Bit or Venmo. And that's like a symbol for what's happened. And so every industry that was under attack from software and digitization has had that problem accelerated. And at the same time, kind of traditional businesses that have had plans on the shelf to get to e-commerce or stuff like that in 10 years have had those accelerated as well. So that's one very clear issue. I think the second thing is we've had this funny mix of nationalism, people closing their borders, but at the same time, transnationalism in the fact that the virus doesn't know any borders. And so there's a need for a coordination function. The coordination functions all failed. In my mind, that is not just fundamental, it's transformative for the way the world needs to operate. And then perhaps the last thing is we've had a failure of institutions. We're sitting here in Israel where the vaccinations worked. Let's look at what's worked. The vaccination worked because Israel has a competitive healthcare system with a single payer system, but it's fundamentally competitive and therefore super competent in logistics. And private enterprises adapted incredibly well. Look what Amazon did to scale up, just as an example. Whereas government institutions that have been around for tens to hundreds of years have, for the most part, not functioned properly during this time. And I think that causes a dramatic rethinking of what's going on here. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I agree with what Michael said. What's interesting on the retail front, he gives examples of companies that weren't necessarily wired for a digitized era have had to accelerate in that direction. I was just looking at some data from Macy's. People don't think of Macy's as a cutting edge technology, e-commerce juggernaut. And yet, if you look at what percentage of the revenues were e-commerce before the pandemic, it was something like 15-20%. By the second quarter of last year, so in the thick of the first wave, their e-commerce sales, Macy's e-commerce sales, had gone up to something like 45% of revenue. So that's a company that you don't think of as an e-commerce, an e-commerce leader, is suddenly learn how to pivot. To Michael's point, I think among the areas that are the most exciting to coming out of this pandemic will be healthcare and education. Both industries, at least in the West, are ripe for disruption, but they haven't been disrupted yet. So let's take healthcare for one moment. Michael mentioned what's happened with the vaccination campaign and healthcare. In the U.S., you're talking about healthcare, something like 15 to 20% of GDP. So it's the biggest force in the U.S. economy, depending on precisely how you measure it. So because of our system, it is very hard to get any kind of diagnostic or treatment services from physicians unless you go into the doctor's office, or you go into the emergency room, or you go into another part of the hospital, or you go to see a specialist. And the notion of doing all that digitally, doing it through the camera on your smartphone, having a digital medical experience, was considered kind of science fiction over here in the U.S. before COVID. Now, during the pandemic, I saw one statistic recently, something like 80% of people who have antibodies who had the coronavirus actually never stepped into a doctor's office or a hospital. I mean, these are all people, by and large, who didn't have severe symptoms. So if you didn't have severe symptoms, but you knew you had something going on and you wanted to get diagnosed, and then you ultimately wanted to get treated, you could do it all with this. Now, our system, both the regulatory regime and the insurance companies, would have never allowed you to do that before coronavirus. And then coronavirus happened, and everyone was incentivized to get diagnosed and get treated without having to leave your home. If some of that can endure post-coronavirus, it will be transformative for the U.S. economy. And I actually think, this is a burgeoning sector. The whole digital health sector in Israel, it's a burgeoning sector. I think Israel is going to be uniquely positioned to capitalize on this. But I think this is a trend this is an industry that's ripe for disruption, and the way we interact with our medical providers is going to be transformed as a result.
I agree with that. I think it extends even beyond just the interaction. You're aware I have this investment in Healthy IO, Yonatan Adiri's companies.
I know them well. Yonatan Adiri, by the way, who's a frequent guest on the Post-Corona podcast. So he's like, I call him the Alec Baldwin of the Post-Corona podcast, because he's such a regular. But yes, I'm a big fan of the company.
And for good reason, by the way, right? But even diagnostics go to the home. Generically, what we've discovered is things that happen centrally are being distributed. By the way, it's true of the workforce, and it's true of diagnostics, and it's true of healthcare. Silly example, nursing, maybe not a silly example, nursing homes were kind of a big epicenter of coronavirus deaths. And I think that we'll see nursing care for the elderly move to the home. I think we'll see diagnostics move to the home. You shouldn't have to go to a centralized place to go get this. And all that will be accelerated by this digitization that will stay with us after coronavirus. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. It'll be interesting to see what comes with the education system. I think one of the other things we discovered in the education system is it has two functions. One is to educate kids, and the other is to babysit so parents can go to work. And it'll be interesting.
I'd say a third is a credentialing system. It's a certificate to launch kids into the workforce.
Yeah, I think, by the way, that's really an interesting topic, credentialing post-corona. That might be the most disrupted of the bunch that we mentioned.
How come?
This notion to pay, $250,000 to get a certificate feels kind of outdated, and feels like this is going to be unbundled in a meaningful way unless the brand endures. I think, by the way, your point about Macy's is exactly that, which is Macy's has a brand. The brand has been transformed from a store experience to e-commerce experience. Harvard likely has a brand. You'd unbundle it probably from the campus. But if you don't have a brand in this new unbundled economy that's likely to emerge, or partly unbundled economy, you're going to be hurting, I think, in this way. So,
it's interesting with higher education in the U.S. It's about a $700 billion industry. It's extraordinary, and the way the higher education, the product offering, is provided has not changed in literally hundreds of years, right? Professor in a classroom with a group of students. That structure, I mean, the big innovation has been like some kind of digital blackboard versus like, the overhead with the slides, the professor using the plastic slides. So there hasn't been real innovation in higher education. It's a massive industry, not as big as healthcare, but really big. And to Michael's point, it could be turned upside down.
I kind of wonder in thought processes. I've been thinking about this for the last few days. So if I'm a contained institution and a contained campus and with the kind of an overseeing dean, a lot of the kind of thought that has become not allowed on campus, let's call it, hasn't conformed to the bon ton of the New York Times, we'll call it, or something like that recently. In a more open environment where some of it's online and I get my certificate elsewhere, or I can get partial certificates elsewhere, I actually think that's a big liberal opening for a real liberal discourse, old liberal with a small L, a liberal discourse on to be able to fill people's minds with different topics and different points of view. And to me, that's been one of the great enablers of technology in general, is that it's opened you up to more opportunity, to more ideas, to more goods and services from more places in the world. And I think that's only positive.
And I think the other side of that is star professors whose only real way for career advancement has been the tenure track at elite institutions can suddenly go find a market outside of the elite institutions through technology. So suddenly these professors can become, media stars is maybe the wrong, but they could really build their own brand to reach students of all demographics, of all ages around the world. And it allows professors to suddenly become very entrepreneurial.
There's a utopian world that I'm listening to hear both of you talking about education and healthcare. That sounds great, but there are going to be challenges for institutions who are not involved in this COVID and trying to protect themselves now. And I think part of them are the unions and the government. Where are they going to?
I don't know. I'm not sure they know. But I think my general view is that a lot of what's changed has come from technology. And there's a bunch of kind of core technology trends pulsing forward right now that will change this. One is obviously cryptocurrency, right? And so it's no wonder that governments are trying to figure out what to do about this, because the government's perhaps largest tool outside of the army or the use of force is the ability to print money. And if you have digital currencies, by the way, whether they're digital dollars or they're Manhattan dollars or Akron, Ohio dollars or whatever they are, or it's Bitcoin or one of these other things, those are entire financial stacks being built in software. My personal view is if you're not embracing this, you're going to be on the wrong side of history. I've been attempting to convince the Israeli government for 5 years now to try to get ahead of this. My partner and I wrote the original Bitcoin document together with somebody in the Bank of Israel 4 years ago. We're not ahead of it yet here, and the U.S. is certainly not ahead of it, and has in fact been fighting it because I think it's an institutional threat. But that will happen, and it's going to happen faster than people think. And the economies like Estonia, for example, or like Mayor Francis Suarez in Miami and Caitlin Long in Wyoming, who have embraced this, are getting more than their fair share of entrepreneurial talent going there. Which brings me to the second point, which is the real challenge for government today and for citizenries is to convince people why you should live here. Why should I live in Israel? Why should I live in the US or New York or Miami? Or why should I live in Germany or China or wherever? Because a lot of people can work at least part of the time far away. But more importantly than that, opportunity is now global. And I think people will choose where to be based on a value system. And so it's absolutely critical for leaders, both government and civilian leaders, to articulate why you ought to live in Israel. Or if Suarez wants to articulate why I live in Miami, he should articulate why you want to live in Miami. And I think a lot of that comes from a society that will build mutual responsibility and solidarity. Moshe Bar Siman Tov, who was the original Director General of the Ministry of Health when Corona started, said about the virus that we're not safe until we're all safe. And he read this book I just put out, which is about what I call the brotherhood economy, or and he said it's true economically as well. Unless we're all kind of safe, nobody's safe. And so some socialists turn that into socialist doctrine. But the real answer is we need to help people empower themselves and find resilience to be able to grow economically. And those are the societies people want to live in, where there's more economic resilience for larger swaths of the population. And we need to make that case in order to attract our unfair share of entrepreneurs to come in. I think that's also one of the results of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Interesting data that Israel's income from taxes in January and February not only did not go down compared to the beginning of 2020, but went up.
Yeah. So in March, when I started talking to the Ministry of Finance, I said, this is an economic or employment crisis. It's not an economic crisis, employment crisis, not an economic crisis, not a health crisis. In November, I heard that we'd gotten back to 96%, and now we're past, because we're a technology economy, and technology has been accelerated, and salaries are up. There's inflation in the salaries of software developers, and there's great income from this technological development. That doesn't answer the question, though, of the employment crisis that is affecting a large part of the population and will continue to, because the economy's moved on, and we need to help people move into that economy and create tons of jobs. But we got to match, to Dan's point, the education system, to this point. And just counting the tax dollars is nice. But if all we do is kind of redistribute it or waste it on bureaucracy, what have we accomplished?
It reflects 50% of the population that doesn't get and pay the taxes at the end of the day. They don't get the digital high-tech salaries in Israel. That's going to back to Dan. You wrote the book, the Startup Nation book, that is very accurate, I think, the theory there. But when you go to practice, still 70-60% of the population is not involved in the startup nation. And this crisis of COVID will enable Israel to get to a $70,000 GDP per capita and thrive. And as Michael said, will be an opportunity for people to come here for a good reason.
Yeah. So just back on how well Israel's economy is doing in the tax revenue issue. Another interesting metric is venture capital. Israel attracted in 2020. So during the year of a pandemic, Israel attracted, Michael may know the precise numbers, something like over $10 billion in global venture capital, which is an extraordinary. It was a rate of increase over 2019 that was higher than the U.S. in terms of the percentage of global venture capital the U.S. attracted. Just to put this in context, you mentioned Startup Nation. When we wrote Startup Nation, we marveled that Israel was attracting $2.5 billion a year in global venture capital. This is about a decade ago, highest per capita attraction of venture capital globally, and now we're at like 5x that number for Israel during a pandemic year. So the tech scene is rocking along, and we can talk a little more about why that is. I do think this is, while not every sector of Israeli life and not everyone up and down the economic ladder in Israel is a direct beneficiary of all this wealth creation in Israel as a result of the tech sector, I think the revenues that are generated as a result of the tech sector do extraordinary things for life in Israel generally, and specifically in support of the government and the security needs of the country. So a thriving tech sector is really indispensable to Israel's economy. And I know that there's some socioeconomic stratification in Israel. I think it is problematic, but it pales in comparison to what's been going on in the West. And I think there is a greater sense of unity in Israel than you see in other parts of the West, and we've seen very specifically during the pandemic. Mike, I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
So this morning I woke up with a bug in my head that I ought to check the birth rates in Israel, because like one of the key stories going around is that in the West, birth rates are down due to the pandemic. I haven't managed to get my hands on the statistics yet, but it appears that there was not a drop in the birth rate in Israel in the same way there was in the rest of the world. And I think that displays a lot of optimism. It's about a country that's optimistic about its future, because you have children when you're optimistic, and you have children when you can deal with uncertainty, which is something I think Israel is particularly.
And Mike, just to be very clear, because people always don't appreciate this, the fact that Israel's fertility rates are so high, reproductive rates are so high, it's not unique to the religious community in Israel. It's across the board. The secular Israelis are producing at large numbers, much like the more Dati parts of the country.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And So this is, I think, a super interesting phenomenon in the pandemic and post-pandemic world. When you couple that with what you just mentioned now, Dan, what I think is super important, not just a spillover impact, but the direct impact of the tech sector on the overall economy. So what Zoom has done, or the pandemic and the lack of flying, is it's reinforced for Israeli entrepreneurs that I can build a full stack global tech company and global brand out of Israel. And when you build these scale up nation companies and not just the startup nation companies, and you build them full stack here, there aren't just engineering jobs. There's marketing jobs and content jobs and sales jobs and services jobs and all the attendant jobs that come around that, from restaurants, to education, to everything else. And I think that's accelerated during this pandemic in this country. And while people are, at least the narrative is, fleeing San Francisco, yet people come back here. Over 100,000 people who came back to Israel. And I think when we finally get our airports right, because our government's not too good at managing stuff, we finally get the airports right, and you can get people in and get them corona tested so we don't get the variants in here, and put them in quarantine properly so they can then come see their families and even move here. We should see a flow of people, because people want to be in an optimistic place where people are having kids, irrespective of where you are on the religious spectrum.
Yeah.
But can I ask Dan a question?
No, of course.
Yeah.
Dan, how do you think about different people are going through coronavirus differently depending on your location? Not just access to vaccine, obviously, but kind of the social norms that develop. What happens differently in the world of both economics and politics post the coronavirus, depending on your location? What has geography done to that?
Well, I think, to your point, people are going to make decisions based on where they want to live for a variety of reasons, including the value system, rather than where they need what economic or what sector economic cluster they need to be near. This notion of being near a cluster or in a cluster, I don't want to say it's over. I think that's too much of an overstatement, but the premium on being near the action, wherever we define the action, goes way down. And once that goes way down, it opens up your world in terms of where you can live. And so I think you're going to see, you're already seeing it in New York, where I live, where people are scattering to all sorts of places, other parts of the state, and obviously other parts of the country, from Texas to Florida to Tennessee. And so, over time, this will change the kind of political composition of many of these places. It's not overnight, but over time, it's gonna places that we think as red states may become a little more blue. Places we think of blue states actually may become a little more red. Some places become a little more purple politically. And so I think we're in for a pretty big transformation. To your point earlier about Zoom, an amazing stat I just saw. Something like, before the pandemic, Zoom was hosting about 10 million people a day, which was considered a lot because it was early days for Zoom. And if you talk to most people, at least in my world, if you talk to most people about Zoom before the pandemic, it was like no one could ever imagine it becoming user-friendly, safe, secure, as inexpensive as it is, because they just didn't have to experiment with it. And then the pandemic happens, we go into lockdown, everyone is forced to experiment with it overnight. And in the spring of 2020, they went from 10 million users a day to something, in the US at least, to something like 300 million users a day, which is extraordinary. So now everyone is Zoom comfortable, which just opens up the world to them. So to this point that anybody can work from anywhere, it's going to change economies and it's going to change electorates. Mike, I guess I'll throw a question back to you, Mike, on this particular point. Do you think Israeli entrepreneurs, in your day job, you spend a lot of time, most of your time working with Israeli entrepreneurs. Do you think they're better wired for this sort of Zoomified world? Because I've always been struck by the notion of remote work is native to Israelis, because many of them work with big customers around the world while they're living in Israel. They in some cases, if they're acquired, they're integrated into bigger companies, multinational companies around the world, while many of them still live in Israel, on different time zones, often working at odd hours from their apartments. So the whole notion of remote lockdown life that we've gotten used to overnight, in a sense, Israelis have been accustomed to that for a long time, not as extreme as we've gone through, but some version of it. And so do you think that that's sort of made them more easily able to adapt to this environment, where in some cases it may have been harder for others?
I do. I think also this kind of notion that I can be anywhere simultaneously and the willingness to kind of work semi around the clock, which you need to do in order to adapt for the time zones, which is a uniquely Israeli trait, I think, to work that much around the clock, has kind of shown up in spades during Zoom. You know, my son got out of the army during Corona and started working at a startup during the same Corona virus. I watched his schedule to get started. So he'd start in the morning, finish his email. So he'd then go kind of work out in the midday, and then kind of 2:30 to 10, he was doing Zooms with the U.S. And he said to me, "Is this normal?" And I said to him, "Maybe it's the new normal. I don't know, but everyone's on these Zooms until 10 o'clock. And my own board calendar has changed. I used to fly to New York and San Francisco, and you'd line up board meetings in a week. But now I can't do them all on the same day because they all start at 4, 6, 7 o'clock. So you have 5 days at the beginning of a quarter, or you're just doing one after another. And you don't see your wife and kids in the evening, which I guess is not good. But maybe it beats the plane. But I think Israel's adopted really well to this. I think the core challenge, I go back to it again, is every place with a booming tech economy needs more talented people. And this is going to be a fierce global competition over what values are you going to offer, what community living values you're going to offer, what housing values you're going to offer to people to come to your community, what innovation, what lack of regulation, by the way. And we talked about crypto before. That's a huge impediment to starting a crypto company is, can I open a bank account and can I get through the regulation, right? So I'll go to Wyoming or Miami or Estonia because it's easier. We need to solve that problem here, and America needs to solve the problem, or it's going somewhere else.
Where's Europe in that question? Like, we're talking about the United States, talking about Israel, and there's a big continent above us here, very close to Israel, that the Israeli economy exports there a lot. Are they going in that way, in that direction?
I think there's three parts to that question. One is something I said about earlier. If demographics is destiny, which it is, and it's economic growth, large parts of the world are shrinking, and Europe is perhaps at the head of that pack because China got a boost from all these people, 300 million people who came out of the suburbs and came to the cities and became productive economic players, or more productive economic players. But Europe is shrinking, and that's a big, big issue at a macro level. I made the joke, but it's not a joke, at the beginning of the pandemic, that they keep playing with the interest rates to kind of stimulate growth. They need to play with child allowances and give people incentives to have babies. That will stimulate growth. And I don't think it's a joke, by the way. I think that's true. It needs to happen. The second thing is, Europe is not one economy, no matter what they'd want you to believe. It's I don't know how many different economies, but Sweden and the Nordics are actually doing great, and there's a fair amount of innovation coming out of there right now. I think my own view is that the UK got lucky on Brexit, and it'll enable them to be more innovative without the kind of regulatory scheme. But there's been a bunch of technology regulation in Europe, like GDPR, which I think is the privacy initiative, which I think is reinforcing monopolistic tendencies in many of those markets that will prevent innovation. I think that's kind of point two. I think point three is no matter how you paint the world, more is going to happen east than in Europe. And I think the most unspoken, most important perhaps development of Israel's deal with the UAE is a bridge to the east. A lot of the Japanese trading companies ran Israel out of Europe because they couldn't run it out of Dubai, but now they can run it out of Dubai. Indonesian, Malaysian, Southeast Asian trade runs a lot through Dubai. We have now opened up that lane. And I think the relationship with the Emiratis, where I've been twice, it's the only place I've been since the pandemic started, is fundamental both to regional cooperation, to this fast-growing place called the Mideast, which most of its population is under the age of 30, and which is in desperate need of innovation. I think Europe and the Emirates can provide, Israel, and the Emirates can provide together. And three, to bridge India, Southeast Asia to this innovative part of the economy. I think that's going to be the huge story of the next 30 years.
Interesting. Dan, what's your take on
Yeah.
Europe?
I agree with Mike. I would say I think there are certain economies in, if we're going to call it Europe, although it's technically not Europe, like the UK, for instance, which is certainly not Europe anymore, which I actually am optimistic about. And I'm especially optimistic about what some of these economies are going to do with Israel, actually. So I think because Israel's vaccination story has been so promising, and it's created all this interest in Israel's healthcare system for a number of the reasons that Michael talked about earlier in this discussion, I think there's going to be a lot more people, both tourists and business people in places like the UK that want to be in Israel and want to be doing things with Israelis. And the appeal of either vacationing or doing business trips in places like, Italy or France are gonna go down. And the appeal of being in an exciting kind of cutting edge place like Israel is going to go up, and it's going to feel safer. I would say, I've been reading this book by Douglas Brinkley, this historian Douglas Brinkley, about the history of America's space race in the 1960s, and he in the book he quotes these newly declassified memos where Kennedy's advisors were basically advising Kennedy the reason that the U.S. needed to go deep into the space race and try to compete with the Soviets, this is after Sputnik, was that countries, among the reasons, countries around the world want to partner with a country that looks like it's like on the frontier of the future, that's like pushing the envelope and leading in places that people haven't gone before. And there was a strategic reason. There were a bunch of science and R&D reasons for the United States to thrust itself into the space race, but there was a geopolitical reason too. Countries in the world want to partner with a country that looks like it's leading into the future. And I was thinking about that both in the context of how Israel has done during the vaccination campaign and how Israel does just in its broader innovation sectors, a lot of the projects that Michael works on. And Michael says he's been to the UAE twice since COVID. Why do countries like the UAE and Bahrain and maybe Saudi Arabia someday, why do they want to partner with Israel? Now, obviously, there's security reasons and intelligence sharing and strategic reasons, but it's also because they want to partner with countries that look like they're leading into the future. And Israel it conveys that, and people want to make a bet on countries and partner with countries that are in that direction.
I have to say, by the way, that my 2 trips to the UAE were like no 2 other trips I've taken. Just the warmth and the curiosity and the interest in talking about technology and innovation, how to lean into your point exactly, Dan. It was inspiring and really heartwarming.
Yeah.
Before we conclude, I want to touch one important point. The governments worldwide during COVID invested a lot of money in trying to save the economy, and they got into a crisis of national debt. Is that going to influence the international economy in the coming future?
Dan, you want to take it first?
I think from the U.S. perspective, I'm very worried about it. Not only the debt load. It's extraordinary how much the U.S. government has spent over the last 10 months, but I also worry about inflation. And particularly the most recent round of stimulus that was passed, that, it wasn't just Republicans that were criticizing the size of it and then the inflationary risks. It was people like Larry Summers and Steve Ratner, who are alumni of the Obama administration, for instance, the Obama economic team. So and the concern is that a big chunk of the funds in the stimulus bill were not for dealing with coronavirus issues. They're actually dealing with a whole range of structural and infrastructural issues that the money won't even be expended in the near term. Even if they wanted to spend it, they couldn't. So there's just money being plowed into the economy for these long-term projects that have nothing to do with coronavirus, and I'm concerned.
I'm with Dan. I'll break it apart a bit. So I'm really worried about inflation. Why are you really worried about inflation? Inflation is a tax on the poor. It just is. And a lot of progressive policymakers say, just borrow more. It's like, modern monetary, just borrow more, borrow more, and borrow more. But they're, at least in theory, taxing the same people. What it is, people with assets get asset inflation. People without assets have trouble keeping up. And so it worries me a lot. When I saw Netanyahu get up on television and say, Janet Yellen said, we can just borrow a lot more money. Interest rates are really low. That's false prophecy in my view, and not appropriate for what we're living in. That doesn't mean you don't need to kind of extend the government balance sheet in order to deal with this. And Israel's balance sheet's been pretty healthy, but it's getting to more dangerous territory right now when we're on the cusp of inflation. Israel has a particular issue because as the U.S. prints more money and the value of the dollar goes down, the value of the shekel has been extraordinarily high on a relative basis. And that impacts the high-tech sector a lot because the salaries get paid in dollars and pay out locally in shekels. So Israel's high growth areas get impacted by the low dollars. But I think there's perhaps a more subtle point, which is borrowing money to hand out spending money doesn't leave long-lasting infrastructure for growth. And what's been missing, I can't speak for the US because I can't even read the stimulus bills, there so long, but I can speak a bit for Israel, is, when the prime minister and the finance walk around and say, okay, we're going to give you a lot of money to stay unemployed. That means you made somebody 1 year older or 1.5 years older because they keep extending it, and they've picked up no more skills. And the economy's moved on, so they don't come back to the economy in any better place. Secondarily, because there's been no government and they just keep handing out money, there's no infrastructure spending, not in human infrastructure making people, or not in physical infrastructure, which drives future growth. So outside of the innovation economy, which innovates in ether because it's software, which is what I'm a part of, when you look at what has the government invested in human capital, in CapEx, in physical capital that creates future growth, the answer is almost nothing. And I'm really against these kind of unemployment benefits, not because we don't have to take care of the people. We have to take care of the people, but we also have to invest in people. And the paternalistic view that if somebody's unemployed so they can't do better is terrible. It's not a values-based system. We have to take responsibility for bringing people to the 21st century. And that's what I hope we can get onto if we ever get a government here, because this idea that we'll just print money and borrow money and not have to pay it back because it's a low interest, it's just false. And every time, they say this time is different. It's not. It never is.
But before we wrap, I just want to make sure we don't forget to hit one point, because Michael, in the conversation you and I had recently, it was very upbeat. It's been a very difficult year, and obviously there's been a lot of suffering, human suffering, catastrophe, both physically and emotionally and mentally for people all over the world. You made one observation that struck me, that this is one of the first times in Israel's history, if not the only time, where every segment of Israeli society has in some way stepped up or thrived in terms of the role they play, not thrived like they're doing great, but thrived in that the contribution that they made to society and public service and the public interest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So historically, if you look at the state of Israel, you had a small ultra-Orthodox population that has now grown, an Arab population, a religious Zionist population, and a general secular population with a broad mix of people in there from more traditional to less traditional. Only those last two populations, the national religious and the secular population, fought in the army and in Israel's wars. So in times of crisis, there's been these two populations that have kind of led the charge, literally and figuratively, to step up to the plate and defend the country and get to work at the time of crisis. This is the first national crisis in Israel, which has hit everybody and where everybody had to step up. And in the recriminations in the press and the politics, because we've been in like constant elections, so you've got, the ultra-Orthodox are not doing this right, and the secular Tel Avivis are, flouting the regulations like this. And it's become this giant tribal narrative. I think that's good to sell newspapers and to, and create headlines and send viral videos. But when you come out of this, I think that's not the truth. The ground truth is everybody's been through a joint trauma, and everybody has to deal with a lot of economic fallout together. And we have a chance, therefore, to reimagine paradigms, because also a lot of the old political functionaries in a lot of these populations have lost power and lost standing during this process, and the civilians have stepped up. And so you have organizations like in the ultra-Orthodox world, like Hatzalah and Zaka, that are frontline warriors in the battle for Corona. And you've got the army walking into Bnei Brak. The army walked into ultra-Orthodox Bnei Brak and took over running the system together with the municipality. My God, it's like the Messiah. And
leaders in Bnei Barak were working with the army, which is also unheard of on this, right?
yeah, and so I think it enables a reimagination of the national discourse on what is national service. Is it only the army, or is it also, could you go to work in Hatzalah or Zaka, and that is your army service, so to speak? And, you know, for the ultra-Orthodox, I read that's a pop, and for the Arabs as well. And, you know, there's
well, many of the physicians, right? Many of the physicians in Israel's hospitals working on coronavirus come from the Israeli Arab community.
Absolutely. And that was what I was going to add, which is, you know, when you're in the coronavirus ward, I don't care who you are as a patient or as a doctor. And so can the Arab population then become a big source of medical professionals to do community and distributed medical health care? And I think we can reimagine a national dialogue coming out of this because of a joint trauma and then a joint need for economic and societal rebuilding that I think is a huge opportunity for Israel. And in a small country, that crucible is such that everybody knows somebody from another segment of society who is affected. And I think that's super powerful. Whereas in previous wars, you only knew somebody from these two sectors who were affected. And to Barsimanto's point, economically, we've got to get everyone raised up right now and got to put people back to work. And that's, I think, a huge opportunity to we don't have aisles here, but to kind of, you know, reach into the next community over or the next hilltop over or whatever it is to go interact and empower people. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And I think Israel will come out of this stronger, not just because of the medical vaccination drive or whatever, but because of a joint trauma that we all now need to kind of put behind us and recover from. Hopefully, you know, hopefully we'll get behind us.
Michael and Dan, I want to thank you for this very optimistic conversation and looking forward to the future now and have more kids.
God bless. Everyone should have more children. You know, I had a friend, Nachum Sharfman, one of the first entrepreneurs I backed. He told me that there are a lot of babies named Nachum because he told people have another baby. And so have another baby. It's a good idea.
So what he really wants is a lot of Michaels running around.
Totally.
What?
You want a lot of Michaels running around.
Be Michael, be Dan. Thank you very much, both of you. Very enjoyed, and go back to the conference and have a good day from here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amiad. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very
But
much.
I prefer to give you a hug next time, not just as across
Yeah.
the room.
All right, sounds good. Take care, guys.